Welcome to Disinformation. I'm Richard Metzger. On tonight's show, you'll meet an extraordinary character, my dear friend Howard Bloom. In the 1980s, Howard Bloom was the top publicist in the music industry with clients like Joan Jett, Michael Jackson, and Prince. His career was legendary, but in 1988, Howard fell ill with chronic fatigue syndrome and has been bedridden ever since. Despite his illness, Bloom typed out the scientific theories he'd been thinking about his entire life. His incredible book, The Lucifer Principle, makes the case that nature has organized all life forms into complex teams which compete with each other in eternal biological conflicts. The Lucifer Principle looks us squarely in the eye and confronts us with the cold and clammy facts. War, death, hatred, and violence are necessary parts of the genetic plan, integral elements of life and of creation itself. I could try to convince you that Howard Bloom is next on a very short list that includes Darwin, Einstein, and Buckminster Fuller, and how he is going to change the way we see ourselves and everything around us. But Howard can probably do a much better job of convincing you himself. Howard, I'm wondering if you could explain the concepts behind your book, The Lucifer Principle.
Well, the Lucifer Principle says that there are basically a trinity of things that drive us. And the trinity of things that drive us are the superorganism, ideas, and the pecking order. Basically, when you put those things together, you've got a conceptual lens through which you can see history in a radically different way.
What's a superorganism?
Okay, what's a superorganism? Let's take a sieve, and we'll take two sponges. We take the two sponges and we run them through a sieve into a bucket of water. What we discover is that these sponges are not the solid things we thought they were. They're actually collections. They're actually nations of cells, of independent cells. And when we strain them through the strainer, the independent cells go their own way. They're perfectly self-contained. They can handle life on their own. They don't need a community, but they do need a community. They need community so badly that they will gather together. Right now they're a soup. They're just a soup within the liquid. But they will gather together and reconstruct their communities over the course of the next day or two until we once again have not one, but two solid sponges in the bottom of the bucket, just as solid as they ever were before. Why? Among other things, they've reconstructed not just a community, but their original community. The yellow sponges have all gathered with yellow sponges over on one side of the bucket, and they've made one solid yellow sponge. The red sponges have gathered on the other side of the bucket, and it's just red sponges from top to bottom, but it's a solid object. Not only do the sponges have a deep need for community, one so deep that they confuse us, that they actually manage to fool us into thinking that they are a consistent whole, but they have a deep need for identity to be with others like themselves. If a red one catches himself in the middle of a bunch of yellows, first of all, the yellows aren't going to want him very much, and secondly, he's not going to want to be there.
Is this a sort of sponge racism?
It's very much a sponge racism. As a matter of fact, if you can't get rid of it among sponges, then you certainly can't get rid of it among human beings who are a good deal more complex. What you have to do is move the kind of racism. Move it from the kind of racism that we see in Zaire, where racism means killing 500,000 people with machetes, or in Kosovo, where it means driving out 1 million people, to the kind of racism we have in the United States, which seems to us to be an appalling thing, but in reality is not, because if you compare it with those two racisms, we do not go after each other with machetes. We go after each other with words. Even the Reverend Elijah Muhammad used to go after me, a Jew, who's, child spawn of Satan, with words. He never came after me with a blade. He never came after me with a machete. He never burned my house down. If we can get racism, which is inevitable, down to the level of discourse, then we've accomplished an incredible thing.
Howard, one of the more radical notions in the Lucifer Principle, and this idea seems to fly in the face of what are the currently acceptable schools of the social sciences, is that our violent behavior comes not from our monkey ancestry, but from our microbial ancestry.
Our original ancestors were bacteria, cyanobacteria, 3.5 billion years ago. Primates of our kind have been around for at most about 16 million years. Primates like us have been around. We have only been around for 100,000 years, which is an absolute nothing. But the fact is, you could already see in the initial colonies of cyanobacteria that one group of cyanobacteria would go to war against a different kind of bacteria, that they would actually use poison warfare. They would use the weapons of mass destruction that we talk about. They would put out various forms of poisoners that would destroy their enemies but would not touch them. And one of the examples in the Lucifer principle comes well, a good deal further forward in history. Not only do we find these things among the 3.5 billion year old bacteria, we find them in these creatures. Well, if you've ever walked out on the shoreline, you'll find tidal pools. And the tidal pools are absolutely magical places. Inside of them, they have the most wonderful looking fluorescent little finger tubules. They just barely move in the water. And you could watch these things for hours. They could become the picture of paradise. Look how beautifully they get along with each other. Well, they don't. They don't get along with each other. Sea anemones live in colonies. In fact, you can find vast, vast mats of them. Those are huge, huge communities. Now, the sea anemones on the inside have the job of finding the food and absorbing it. But then there's a periphery of sea anemones, which are basically sea anemone warriors. And they are built to kill. Who are they built to kill? Other sea anemones. They're built to battle constantly for new territory with other sea anemones. We don't notice it because it takes place on a time scale to which we are not accustomed. However, if we were to fast forward it, take one frame every 3 minutes and do time-lapse photography, you would see a battle going on in a monumental First World War, Second World War scale among sea anemones. If it goes on among sea anemones, how the fuck are we going to get away from it?
So, are we born with original sin?
We are born as fingertips of evolution. And there is a problem with being fingertips of evolution. Evolution is one of the most creative processes we've ever seen. We started in the first 10 to the minus 30 seconds of the Big Bang with nothing. We started with a ripple in something called a false vacuum. Just a little tiny ripple, and it was tiny. It was infinitesimal. And from that time on, we've ended up with subatomic particles. Whole new invention, radically different than anything that had ever existed before. Atoms, again, a giant step up. One small step for subatomic particles, one giant leap for universe kind. Then we've moved to molecules, planets, suns, galaxies, and entire systems of galaxies, not to mention human beings like you and me. There's a small problem, though, with this evolutionary process, especially as it applies to living things. In living things, the process goes according to, well, it's what was called evolution red in tooth and claw. There's been a lot of debate about whether that was some sort of Victorian misnomer. It's not a Victorian misnomer. If a lion wants to feed her children, which is a wonderful and benevolent thing to do, any lion mother who doesn't want to feed her children is a child abuser or a cub abuser, as the case may be. But if she wants to go and feed her child, what does she have to do? She has to bring down a gazelle. And then she has to start to tear its guts out while its eyes are still rolling in its head and it's still very alive and it's still very aware of what's going on in the last seconds of its life. So which is it? Is she an abuser if she refuses to take down gazelles and starves her children? Or is she the abuser if she insists on going after some gazelle and ripping it limb from limb while it's still alive? She has no choice. One way or the other, she has to be red in tooth and claw. We are children of the evolutionary process. And the evolutionary process happens to work by using destruction for creation. It's like a sculptor. In the book it says that nature and evolution are very much like a sculptor. You take a piece of marble and it's one giant unified thing. You take a chisel to it. What could be more destructive? You take a chisel and a hammer to it and you begin to chisel and chisel the flakes away. You don't give a damn for the flakes on the floor. You don't think, is that flake in pain? Is that flake having emotional problems because it's been isolated? No, you just simply smash at the parts that need to be taken away in order to create the Michelangelo masterpiece that's implicit in the piece of marble. Well, unfortunately, the marble on which nature works, on which evolution works, consists of you and me and the amoeba in the pail and other living beings, or the antelope that's taken down by the mother lion. And we have feelings. And every one of us feels, I have a right to live. And I have a right not to be treated with savagery. I have a right not to have my guts torn out so that I can be fed to lion cubs. And indeed, we do have that right, which means that basically evolution has built something disastrous into us. It's built something absolutely diabolical into us. If you want to say this, it has built the devil into us. Not original sin, but the fucking devil itself.
If what you say in the book is true and we are hardwired for violence,
and we are,
well, how do we outrun the Lucifer principle then?
Self-awareness. Remember, our brain is a conjury. Our brain is like the Congress that took place in 1788 in Paris, when they decided to have a revolution in France. They brought together squabbling people from all over the country to try to put together some sort of a government. Well, our brain is one big squabble. It's like a parliament in which people are always shouting each other down. It has many pieces which battle each other, and over the course of time, culture has radically rewired the human brain. Now, culture is something that's in our hands, and culture is also a matter of taking certain brain parts and favoring them over others. We have to wire our brains through culture to focus on the creative elements, to focus on the elements, again, that involve commitment and closeness with other human beings, and to rule the elements out that are back in the amygdala, that are down in the limbic system, that are down in the reptilian sources of the brain, and the neo-mammalian senses of the brain, that come from a real